Hey guys, what's going on? This is petervirag here. I hope you're all having an awesome day. Today I'd like to share a few tips and tricks on how to ensure that you come out with super sharp, text sharp images when taking stacked macro shots using a manual focusing rail. But you can definitely apply some of these tips when you're shooting out in the field as well. So let's get started. Tip number one, use the right aperture for your particular lens. In my case, I use the Laowa 25mm ultra macro lens at f2.8, which is the widest aperture on that lens. It is a little bit softer than, let's say, when we step down one or two full stops to f4 or f5.6. I use f4 when I'm using the manual focusing rail for extreme macro shots, when I'm stacking multiple images. But when I'm out in the field, I found f8 to be the most optimal aperture because it gives me enough depth of field. So sometimes I can get away without the need of stacking. For example, I can get the entire head or definitely the eyes of an insect in focus, and gives me pretty good results. Tip number two, the shutter speed always should be as fast as possible. Why is that? Because you want to minimize motion blur. Simple as that. When you're out in the field taking 2.5x, 5x magnification shots, you definitely need a speed light flash because the ambient light usually or generally isn't enough. It doesn't provide you with enough lighting when you are that close. At the depth of field, that super shallow depth of field, the effective aperture is super tiny, so there's barely any light, which you will experience if you try to shoot at let's say 8 outside at 5x magnification with this particular lens. You won't be able to see anything through the viewfinder. Tip number three, use a very steady, sturdy tripod. That's a must, an absolute must. I suggest you invest into something that is super reliable. There are plenty of options out there, from Manfrotto to the little bit more pricey range from Gitzo, but you gotta make that decision. Most tripods these days are fairly reliable. Tip number four, overshoot for stacked images. In order to ensure that the subject is in focus from front to back, you have to be able to cover every single focal plane or the majority of focal planes. And when they are stacked in post, for example with ZERENESTACKER or HELICON focus or even Photoshop, then you have an image where the entire subject is in focus, and that's the end goal. You possibly have to reshoot and take multiple images at the same focal planes as well, just to make sure you know that every single focal plane is covered perfectly. That's gonna make it so much easier for post-processing software such as ZERENESTACKER to make sure that the entire subject is in text sharp focus. After you cover a particular focal plane and you move the macro rail by using that little knob on the side on the X or Y axis, just make sure that you pause a little bit and wait, because camera shake can occur and you want to eliminate that chance as well. Another way to minimize vibration or motion is by the use of the remote shutter cable or remote cable release, which is an absolute must. If you don't have access to that, then you can use the timer on the camera, but it doesn't do as good of a job. Plus it's more time consuming and camera shake can still occur. So I suggest you invest into a cable release, and that's definitely gonna come very handy when taking extreme macro shots. Additionally, on many cameras such as my camera, the Canon EF-S, there's a silent mode as well. This actually means that the electronic first curtain shutter is used and the mechanical shutter is only actuated at the end of the exposure. That reduces the vibration even further. I also suggest you use mirror lockup if you're not using live view. You also need to ensure that your subject stays still. In the field, this is almost impossible at times, especially with super skittish and mobile insects. They are just not gonna cooperate, they fly away, they get really scared when you approach them. If you are taking super deep stack shots of a dead specimen, you still need to be cognizant of the fact that, for example, the antennae or the limbs might slightly move after you put the specimen on the stage. You just gotta make sure that there is no movement throughout the whole sequence of shots. That can take an hour and a half, especially with a manual focusing rail. You also need to ensure that your subject is properly framed and you leave enough space around it, because as you move closer to the subject, the perspective changes, the magnification ratio slightly changes as well, and that can result in severe artifacting in post-processing after images have been aligned and blended. So you need to be cognizant of that, because that needs to be usually cropped out in post, unless you want to spend about an hour or two on each frame trying to clone stamp and heal and do content aware fill, but that's not going to do a good job. So I suggest you don't go down that path. I also recommend the use of dedicated software such as ZERENESTACKER or HELICON Focus, because they tend to do in general a much better job and they are much more efficient than, let's say, Photoshop when stacking and aligning shots, and usually the end result is of much higher quality. You also need to do a little bit of post-processing work when it comes to sharpness. Experiment a little bit with the high-pass filter option in Photoshop. It is a very customizable tool and does a pretty good job, especially when you try to focus on just certain areas, sharpen only certain parts of your subjects. I tend to focus on the eye, for example, of insects, and definitely don't sharpen, for example, the background or the darker areas where there isn't much information, because you don't want to introduce noise there, especially when you print them. It's just not gonna look good. So that's it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video and found some pieces of information useful. If you did, then smash that like button and subscribe to me, and see you guys in the next one. Peace.